All right, in this video, we're going to talk about, does technology change how we learn? And with that, we'll kind of give you a framework for how to think about this when you're choosing technology tools to use in your learning and your teaching and your students' learning. So you may have heard this before. A long time ago, before we had the written word, people learned by memorizing. They'd tell things word of mouth, it would go back and forth. And then writing came in where we could write things down. And Plato said this about it: they will cease to exercise memory because they rely on that which is written. They will seem to know much, while the most part they know nothing. So, why did he think that if we were writing things down, we wouldn't know anything anymore? Well, it was mostly because at the time, learning was very closely related with memorizing and recalling. Now, I'm sure that there was a little more than that too, but that, if you remembered and knew a lot of stuff from memory, that meant you were probably pretty smart. But then we had this new technology, which is the written word. And when that came through, we didn't have to memorize quite as much. We could focus more on this understanding and analyzing. So in this case, the new technology, which was writing, really made a big difference in how we learn and even how we teach, because teachers are now writing things down and such instead of just saying things to students. Let's talk about another technology, the smartboard. There's a lot of smart boards out there, and especially when they first came out, we had a question. Is it going to change teaching and learning? We're going to start with teaching, what the teacher does. Often in the beginning, just like a chalkboard, a teacher would just write on the smartboard as if it was a whiteboard. And that's not necessarily changing anything because the students are still sitting passively, listening to the teacher teach and write things on the board. So we have a framework sometimes we use to help us understand this dynamic. It's called the RAT, R-A-T. So one is replace, then amplify, then transform. So if all we're doing is doing the same thing with a new technology, really we're just using it to replace. Now we might find that it's easier to save things and stuff, so that might get into the amplify part. But often when we get new technologies, all we do is replace. We're going to use this format too, because this is going to build up to the PICRAT. So you see down here at the bottom, it says teacher's use of text does what to traditional practice. You can think of what traditional practice is usually the teacher teaching things, telling things to the students, and the students memorizing or thinking and analyzing. So we have replace, amplify, and transform. But we can also think about what the student is using the technology for. So here, the question is the student doing anything different? They could write on a chalkboard. They could also write on a smartboard. And if that's what we're doing, they're not really doing much different. For this framework, the student's relationship to the technology comes on this vertical axis, and it can be passive, interactive, or creative. Passive is when the student is just sitting and listening. They're not really actively doing anything. And that's how a lot of classrooms in the past have been, and I bet a lot of lecture classes still are. Interactive is more when they're actually doing something and interacting with each other, with technologies. So that adds a level of technology use. And then creative is they're actually creating something with it. And it was a little tricky to find a good example on a smartboard, but this seemed to be a pretty good one. Where they're actually able to create. Now, this might not be that different from drawing on a chalkboard, but perhaps maybe it is in some ways. So that's the PICRAT the PICRAT theory. So we have the framework. Teachers' use of technology, it could be replacing what they usually do, amplifying it, or transforming it. And then students' relationship is passive or interactive or creative. So let's look at a couple examples and see where they might fall. So the first one here is a student watching an instructional video. Is that replacing, amplifying, or transforming what we usually do in learning? I think that for the most part, this is replacing. In some ways, it might amplify because the teacher doesn't have to be in the room with the student. But when we talk about traditional practice of the teacher giving the student information, It's just another way to do that. Now, is it passive, interactive, or creative? On this version, it's just passive. The student's just sitting there looking at it and hopefully thinking, but they're not actually interacting. So that instructional video comes in passive and replaces. And these aren't totally clear cut, but it helps you start thinking about it. Let's look at another example, the interactive video, like an Edpuzzle, which you might be doing now. An Edpuzzle where you watch and it stops and it asks you questions. What is that doing for teachers? Is it replacing, amplifying, or transforming? For me, it's replacing and maybe amplifying. So it's still a teacher and they're asking questions of students, but that could be done very easily without the technology. One thing it does amplify is it allows every single student to answer and the teacher to see every single student's answer and for them to go at their own pace. So that's why you might put it under amplify, but it doesn't quite get to transforming. How about for the students? Are they passive, interactive, or creative? This one's pretty easy, it's interactive, right? So when we put these together, we get interactive video that could kind of be in this area in here. Here's another. How about if they're actually creating a video? So the students, instead of just watching a video or interacting, they're creating. The teacher's use of the technology, what is this doing? Is it replacing traditional practice, amplifying, or transforming? I think this is where we really get to amplify and maybe even transforming. I can see how you can make a case for it to be transforming. They're actually doing something where the student's creating something instead of the teacher just telling them something. How about the student's relationship, passive, interactive, or creative? This is creative, right? This is where we get to actual creative uses where they're creating something. And remember this slide we had before where we talked about in Plato, learning was memorizing and recalling. And when we could write stuff down, we could focus more on understanding and analyzing. When we start doing things like creating videos, that's where we get to this communicating and engaging. We're actually learning to communicate our understandings and engage in the world through doing these things instead of just listening and thinking. Okay, we got one more. This time, the student's creating a video, but they're not just creating a video for their teacher. They're creating a video and they're going to make it a commercial. And the commercial is going to be on conservation and protecting wildlife. And they plan to take this commercial and put it on social media. So, are they replacing, amplifying, or transforming? When the teacher gives this assignment, what are they doing? This is where we really get to transforming, because at this point, they're actually using their learning to change the world. And so it says that learning is actually more than just engaging, it's really participating in society and making a difference. And then, of course, this is also creative. And so that's where we get over here. We're creating commercial on some topic and we're sharing it. And that's where we get to creating and contributing. We're actually going beyond just bringing things in ourselves. We're transforming to where learning means actually taking action in the world. So we've talked about PICRAT here, and we've talked about these ways of learning. We've also talked about how technology, sometimes it doesn't change teaching and learning. Like if we're just doing the same thing with the new technology that we always did without it, or it can actually change how we're teaching and learning. And that's when technology starts making a bigger difference in the classroom instead of just being a really expensive whiteboard. So key takeaways, technology, it can change learning, but often it doesn't. A lot of time we just use it for the same old things. PICRAT helps us think about how we're using a new technology and how it impacts teaching and learning. And it kind of can help us push towards more transformative uses. Thanks for watching.